Hello, Ilesh. Just a quick recording here at the back of 2025, looking forward to next year. And I've got a few questions, three questions for you. But we'll start with this first one. And what do you think the most important thing that will happen with AI models in 2026?
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, so I think a lot will happen in 2026. So in some ways, it's hard to pick any one, but for this purpose, I think what we'll see is we'll see more and more kind of general and frontier models appearing on the scene. But what I think the biggest shift will be is that the way they're used. So we'll start to see them being used as agentic systems. And basically what that means is that we're turning AI from an advice giver into an actual doer. They will autonomously go off and do things. And that presents a lot more risks than we've really understood from kind of AI models in their own right today, because due to the autonomy, because they're able to just go off and say, for example, do planning, orchestration, take real world actions. The threats are shifting from not from the passive outputs to the active interventions that these models will make. So key dangers, for example, include vulnerabilities like abuse of the privileges that the models have, or you could ask it potential questions, what we refer to as prompt injections, and force it to do things it wasn't designed or developed to do. You could potentially, as a result of doing that, you could potentially get an AI agent, a la frontier model, to disclose large volumes of confidential and sensitive data within your organization, which then of course leads to all the kind of downsides that we typically know from large scale data breaches that have occurred before. And from a human point of view, we're also potentially going to become even more reliant on these kinds of frontier models. And that means that things like deception, bias, and what have you, become even more important from a governance point of view as society becomes even more reliant on them.
I guess that it's just becoming more embedded and more complex. And therefore, the ability just for human oversight alone to be able to detect things that are deficient is going to become more and more difficult.
Absolutely. So it's going to become more and more challenging. The only kind of saving grace is, I think, that in 2026, we're going to see a lot more regulatory burden put on AI developers and users of AI. So for example, as you know, we'll see the advent of the EU AI Act. We're already seeing other things coming on stream from at one end, places like Brazil and South America, Australia at the other end of the globe, and many, many places in between, are introducing regulatory frameworks that will come into force at varying points during the next 12 months. And so there will be that requirement for people and developers and deployers to be very careful and have the governance frameworks and guardrails and mechanisms to make sure that these things are operating continuously in a responsible and safe way.
I mean, one of the things that I've got really interested in over the last sort of month or so is, we talk in these sorts of terms, and they're always sort of slightly couched in the negative. I've been getting more and more interested in the fact that you can go and basically dissect AI models, understand how they work, and actually get them to be much better and more accurate, because having a poorly performing AI model might be better at what went previously, but it still misses potential customers, potential outcomes, because it isn't completely accurate.
Yeah. So, in essence, general purpose and or frontier models are typically just black boxes. We ask it something, it gives us something out, and we are to a large extent required to trust the output. But yeah, absolutely, there are mechanisms, technologies, and procedural approaches to ensure that the model is doing what it was designed to do. It's doing it error free, fairly, not discriminating against any one group, for example, and so on. And there are various ways of doing that. There are mechanisms available today that allow us to open the model up and, for example, ask it a bunch of questions. So, for example, we can take the example of, would I be, if it's say a model that's going to be used to decide whether somebody's a good credit risk or a bad credit risk. We can then specifically ask the model that what parameters in the data will you use are the most important ones to decide whether somebody's a good credit risk, and at what point will you say no, and at what point will you say yes, and that then opens up that so-called black box up, because it now allows us to understand exactly how it's making the decisions to, for example, approve John for a loan but turn Ilesh down. And that means that we can explain exactly what's happened, and we can understand, was that what was intended for the model to do? If not, we can go back and retrain it until it does perform in the way that it does. The other slightly more challenging element to this is that governance isn't just a one-off thing. You have to keep doing it continuously, because the behavior of models changes as well based on what they learn as a result of the use they have. And that means that you continuously need to be testing these models to make sure they're always behaving in the way that you had initially planned.
Next question for you. Biggest misconception you see organizations making about AI bias and governance?
Yeah, that's interesting, because governance is quite a broad topic, even more so when it comes to AI. But typically what seems to be happening so far is that both bias and governance are treated as kind of technical problems that whoever you got the model from should be dealing with. I suspect that still in 2026, organizations are likely to acquire third-party models either from the open source community or actually purchase them from vendors, and they will just assume that these models are fair, that they're not biased, that they're doing exactly what they were supposed to do, and so on. And even though there is technology out there available, including the sorts of things that we've developed that allow you to scan models for bias, test the data sets on which they were trained for bias, etc. That potentially isn't going to be enough, because bias isn't just a bug in the model. Often it's the way that the result is interpreted, for example, by the individual who ultimately makes the decision. And also because, as I said before, models, the behavioral model changes. So again, you need to be looking at bias as a continuous activity. You can't just rely on the fact that the vendor tells you that, yes, we've tested the model and it meets the following criteria. Here you are, you can deploy it. It needs to be a continuous exercise. And finally, if we implicitly treat bias as a one-off defect that can be fixed with better data or modifying the parameters for fairness, we're somewhat missing the breadth of the problem, because a lot of these biases are rooted in business processes, and that means that those biases aren't necessarily easily fixed. And this is why I say also that it's an organization wide issue, especially if you're developing the AI model with your own data from your own organization, because you then need to consider how representative the processes in your own organization are and how those will be reflected in the data that you're using.
Yeah.
Even though that data may appear on the face of it, even when you use a bias scanning tool, it may appear on the face of it to be representative. But if you haven't understood the business processes that have led to the derivation of that data, then you may still fall foul of the problem, the very problem you're trying to fix.
So over time, sort of the way that data is collected has subtly changed within organizations. So you're not dealing with something which is consistent.
Absolutely, because we just because we've so-called technically debiased the model, it doesn't mean that data in itself didn't have intrinsic bias. So we need to understand the business processes and the people that have interacted leading to that data, to really deal with bias in a more comprehensive and holistic way, as opposed to just worrying about whether there's 50% representation of men and women in the data set, for example.
Well, I mean, I live a lot of my world in the world of HR software, and a lot of AI is being adopted into recruitment processes. And I think that's going to be, you know, there are well-known sectors that are high risk: healthcare, financial services. But everybody recruits. All organizations go out and are using these sorts of tools. I think many of them don't have a clear understanding of what the potential risks and downsides of deploying these types of systems. Anyway, question 3 for you.
Sure.
If you are a data scientist or AI lead just now, what's the one thing that you should be doing today or adopting in 2026?
Yeah. So if you're an organization that's just setting out to do your first AI kind of project, so you've identified a use case and you're going to start implementing something to do that, then in some ways it's easier, because you should set out from the start to make sure you implemented the governance requirements from end to end through the AI lifecycle, and not just created a bunch of documents that say this should be done and that should be done, but actually implemented that through the AI lifecycle from beginning to end. However, if you're somebody who's already got a lot of systems in place, say for example a few dozen, then what you need to do, and you've never had a proper governance framework or any kind of procedures in place when you were developing those systems or acquiring them from third parties, then I think the most important thing you should do is prioritize those systems that you have and take the most important one with the highest, the one that could have the highest impact if it went wrong, and begin to open that system up and see whether it does actually meet the governance requirements, whether the guardrails are really in place, whether it is behaving as it was designed to do, whether you would be able to handle incidents if something went wrong, etc. And see that as your reference implementation for good AI governance in your organization, and then try to make that a repeatable process so that it doesn't become too burdensome as the number of systems begins to grow within your organization.
So it's building best practice for deployment.
Yeah, absolutely. Ideally, we would like to have that happen right from the start. If we adopt the phrase from the world of security, then we could almost call it AI governance by design. So yeah, but unfortunately that so far, certainly up to the end of 2025, we don't see that as being the mindset in most organizations. So yeah, if you're starting your journey in 2026, then try to adopt this kind of AI governance by design approach. But if you've already deployed systems within your organization, then pick the one that is potentially the highest risk and highest impact if something went wrong, and try to build the governance capability within that system, and then try to do it in a repeatable way so that you can then maintain good governance across your AI asset landscape.
Well, that's great. Thanks very much, Ilesh. And hopefully this sort of advice people can adopt and deploy in 2026.
Absolutely. Thanks, John.
Cheers, Ilesh. Bye now. Bye.